Welcome to this last edition of the Design and Democracy Digital Talk series, and especially warm welcome to the participants of the Design Campus Summer School 2021. My name is Amelie Klein. I am a design curator, and together with my colleague Vera Sacchetti, I curated the summer school, which is part of the Design Campus. And the Design Campus is a curatorial-driven, interdisciplinary, future-oriented platform for rethinking some of the major questions of our times through the lens of design. So it was launched this summer at the Dresden Kunstgewerbemuseum at Pillnitz Palace and Park. And here we are. We dedicated this inaugural summer school to design and democracy because we believe that democracy and its current crisis are arguably one of the most urgent issues of our time. And because we think that design is an important and very valid starting point for an analysis and discussion about this crisis. We are now in the last week 6 of the summer school. So it'll finish on this Friday, August 28th, I think. And this week we dedicate to telling the stories on writing, curating, and sharing. So we are discussing how writing, curating, collecting, and other ways of talking and thinking about design and about democracy could become more accessible and more participatory. And this is where our amazing guest of this lecture comes in. And I am handing the mic to my colleague Vera, who will now introduce our guest.
Hello, everybody. My name is Vera Sacchetti, and as Amelie said, I am one of the curators of this year's edition of the Design Campus, dedicated to design and democracy. Very excited to welcome our guest today, a dear friend, a brilliant professional, Avinash Rajagopal. He is the editor-in-chief of Metropolis magazine, an award-winning publication with home base in New York City. He has spoken frequently and moderated frequently at many events related to interior design, architecture, urbanism, and he's also hosting the biannual Metropolis Perspective Sustainability Symposia. He has authored Hacking Design, a book published, an e-publication published by the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, and has contributed to several volumes on design history, including The Culture of Nature in the History of Design, which was published by Routledge in 2019, and Future Design Museum's Atlas of Furniture Design, where he contributed a chapter on contemporary design. I am very happy to welcome Avinash here today. Avinash was on Amelie's mind, on my mind as well, when we first decided to plan this lecture series. And why Avinash? I mean, Avinash has been doing a fantastic work over the last few years at Metropolis, and really an editorial work that tries to put climate crisis front and center in the media discourse related to the specialized media discourse related to architecture and design. Avinash is going to be telling us about this, about climate action and the design media. And without further ado, I will let him do his presentation. Just as a reminder, this talk is being streamed live on YouTube, and everybody who's watching can happily, through the chat on YouTube, submit their questions. We will also be gathering questions of our participants here in Pillnitz, and we will be, after Avinash's lecture, we will be, Amelie and myself will be asking a few questions. If you submit questions, we will ask your questions as well. Welcome, Avi.
Thank you so much, Vera, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to be talking as part of Design Campus and within this series around design and democracy. So I'm going to share my presentation with you now. So let's just give me a second to get that going. All right. So we're talking today about building consensus around design and climate change. And in order to do that, I'd like to give you some context. I'd like to introduce, what Metropolis is, what my role and my worldview within Metropolis is, and also what the problem is that we're trying to address. And then we'll talk about two initiatives in great detail, that Metropolis is involved in at the moment, and a third one that I'm hoping we will see take off towards the end of this year, and that I invite all of you, if you have any ideas or inputs, to write into me and tell me what you think. I'd love to hear. So some context here. Metropolis is a 40-year-old trade publication in the United States. What we call a trade publication is basically, it has a readership mostly of professionals. So it's catered to a particular segment of society. We have 50,000 architects and interior designers who subscribe to Metropolis, who get the print magazine 6 times a year. We have about 89,000 unique visitors online per month. And our social audience is about 300,000 people. So you have to understand that, compared to maybe other media outlets, we don't have a huge circulation, but our circulation is very focused. If you consider that there's about 80,000 architects practicing in the United States, we have a pretty good chunk of all professional architects in the US. So that definitely influences the way we talk about a whole host of issues. A little bit about myself. I started at Metropolis in 2011 as an editor. I became editor-in-chief of the magazine in 2017. So it's been about 5 years as editor-in-chief of the magazine. And I came into the magazine, with a staff and with a group of editors who were already extremely concerned about the role of design in the world and the impact that design can have on society, but also the impact that society has on design, and sort of how that relationship is shaped through the media and what we do at Metropolis. Over the years, Metropolis has had many firsts. We were actually the first US design publication to dedicate an issue to sustainability in 1996. We were talking about sustainability topics way before that. We did a big article in 1992 about solar panels and why architects should adopt solar energy. So there was this history already of us talking about ecological issues. And of course, that's not coincidental. If you know your history of the ecological movement, over the 60s and 70s, there was a huge groundswell of interest. But really, it wasn't until the 90s that action began to coalesce, especially at the corporate level and at civil society level around sustainability. In 2003, this other cover that you're seeing here, we were the first magazine to publish some research that was being done then around the impact that architects and interior designers, so our core audience, the impact that they were having on the climate crisis. So if I don't know if you're able to read that cover line, it says architects pollute, and then the subline says, an alarming new analysis of global warming says architects are the problem and our best solution. Okay, so our stance has always been to point out to our audience what their culpability or responsibility is within this larger crisis that we have. And just so you know, sustainability is not the only thing Metropolis covers. We cover a whole host of other things. I recently wrote an editorial saying that in our 40 years, maybe the one thing that we haven't paid enough attention to is race and racial politics. So, we've always had the intention to do the right thing. Just to give you some context there, this talk is taking place in the context of a decorative arts museum, and the collection of the museum is primarily, objects collected that were made pre-industrial revolution or during and immediately post the industrial revolution. So roughly, about 100, 120 years from where we sit today. And you can see just with these numbers, the amount, this is basically the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. So pre-industrial revolution, it was about 280 parts per million. About 2 years ago, we were at about 412 parts per million and rising. So no natural processes, no processes that are not man-made account for this increase in carbon dioxide in the air. And one of the things that was born in the late 1700s and early 1800s is, of course, the Industrial Revolution, and out of Industrial Revolution, the thing that we today call design, right? And so the birth of design is very much tied to the birth of the climate crisis. And I think that's one of the first things that we have to acknowledge. So all the objects that are collected in the museum have a role to play in the climate crisis. All the objects that we as designers today continue to create have a role to play in the climate crisis. Needless to say, architects contribute to climate change. And the analysis that we provided was this one. It was done, the article we wrote was about Edward Masria, who's an architect here in the United States, and he's been really one of the fathers of the climate action movement here in the US. And he founded a nonprofit called Architecture 2030. This is a graph taken from them. So if you look at global carbon dioxide emissions by sector, architecture influences about 39% of all carbon dioxide emissions in the world. And so 28% of that comes from building operations, which means how buildings are used. And about 11% comes from how buildings are made and put together, right? And if you notice, there's a little bracket here that says core and shell. For those of you who are interested in that geeky little detail, core and shell has to do with, the sort of shell of the building, the walls, the windows, the doors. The core is your floor plates, your staircases, your elevators, your mechanical systems. It doesn't count all the stuff that's in the museum. It doesn't count all the furniture and the lighting and the couches and chairs and all the stuff that we fill our homes and our offices and our hotels with, right? So that 11% likely is higher than even what is represented here. Quite possibly that 32% you're seeing in industry and that 23% you're seeing in transportation definitely feeds into this huge amount of objects that are designed and then mass produced and then purchased, marketed and purchased and brought into our homes and offices every year. So we have even a greater responsibility there. Why am I talking about this at an event about design and democracy? Well, in the United States, it turns out that action around climate change is very much tied to democracy. Okay, so in the US context, at least, climate change is partisan. Not everybody agrees on climate change, and not everybody agrees even on the fact that I threw off, when we were talking about the parts per million in carbon dioxide, clearly that it is human activity that's made the difference. So, even Republicans with a very high exposure to science knowledge who have advanced degrees, only 17% of them acknowledge today that human activity is responsible for global climate change. So if you don't even believe that human beings are responsible for climate change, how are you as an architect supposed to take action and reduce, the impact of your work? So we are starting a pretty uphill battle here in the US. I know it's different in different parts of the world, but certainly in the US, it is a challenge of democracy, okay? And if you think that, oh, well, those Republicans, that 17% or, those folks who don't believe in climate change, oh, those are sort of, I don't know, like truck drivers and, whatever, and not architects and designers and who are, creative and amazing people who believe in good in the world. That is not true. So the architecture profession in the United States, this is an article that Metropolis published last year, is surprisingly older and much less progressive than we might imagine. In fact, in the 2016 election in the United States, the election that gave us Donald Trump, regardless of where you are in the world, I hope I don't have to explain why that election was important. In that election, architects voted with a very, very slim majority for Democrats. And their voting patterns in general on other things on the ballot were actually more closely aligned with Trump supporters, right? So, so we do have a profession that we assume is progressive, that we assume has certain values, but actually that may not always be the case. So we have a task ahead of us in terms of getting the architecture and design professions to acknowledge that we have a problem, that human activity does contribute to climate change, to acknowledge that about 39% of the world's carbon emissions are in our hands, and then to do something about it, right? So that's a multi-part process. And of course, Metropolis is not the only one. I mean, there's lots of amazing organizations working on this, and we've made some progress, okay? So if you look at that, the floor area, the amount of area of building we've built since 2005 to 2019 over the past, about 15 years has gone up slightly, but actually our energy use has come down by 1.7%. That's not enough, but it is coming down. And our carbon dioxide emissions have actually come down by about 20%. It's debatable whether that 20% is due to the actions of architects and interior designers, or is it due to other factors like our electricity supply becoming more clean and responsible, or manufacturing processes becoming better. So, a lot of things feed into that, but overall, we're not doing nothing. But the question is, are we doing enough? There's the other half of our readers who are interior designers. Okay, so remember that core and shell little thing that I was telling you about. The problem is we focus, so even the focus that we've put it on architects, because architects use concrete and steel, these very carbon intensive building materials, and they build these structures. We think of, in general, there's a cultural stereotype of interior design as being a soft art, right? Like it's about culture, it's about, health and well-being, like it's about comfort, like is the sofa comfortable, right? That's our primary concern, not what is the carbon emissions of the sofa that I'm buying to put in my home, right? So the role that interior designers play has been underestimated. And so at the end of 2020, which is where now I'm bringing it full circle and our real discussion starts, we published an article that pointed out that interior design is hugely responsible, and that over a period of the next 30 years, over a period, by about 2050, interior designers might be responsible for maybe around 8 to 10% of the world's carbon emissions if we don't do anything about it now. So that's a pretty sizable chunk and a pretty big responsibility that interior designers have. And when I say interior design, you have to understand interior design is, one of those professions that connects to a whole lot of other design professions. So anybody who's doing furniture design or lighting design, whatever you produce is ultimately being sourced by an interior designer, or it's going into an interior design scheme. So it really is this umbrella for a lot of product manufacturing, a lot of other manufacturing, a lot of other economic activity that happens in the world today. And all that influence adds up. So let's talk about that carbon footprint of interior design a little bit. And please bear with me as we talk through the details on this, because it's important that you understand that it is a sizable problem. Interior designers will influence about 19% of all building emissions by 2040. And if building emissions still end up being, about 40% of the world's carbon emissions, that's a big slice of the world's carbon emissions that we're going to influence by 2050 as interior designers. And the issue with the first issue you have to understand with interior design is something called embodied carbon. So some of you may be familiar with this concept, some of you may not be. When we talk about carbon emissions, what we mean is all the carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases that are put in the air during some kind of activity. So you make a chair. When you make a chair, you have to use energy to make that chair. That energy means necessarily that some carbon dioxide is going into the air. The only way humans, the plants know how to make energy without burning things, but even they, synthesize into carbon dioxide in their leaves. So, we as humans don't know we haven't yet cracked how to create energy without burning something, other than solar or wind or renewable sources. Most of our energy is fossil fuels, and all of that involves burning carbon. So safe to say, in a dirty process, a chair is made and it puts some carbon in the air. So for a building or an interior, about 72% of the energy of the emissions that it will put in the air over its lifetime come from all the things you do in the space. So you turn on a light switch, that means some energy is coming from some power plant somewhere, some carbon is going in the air, those emissions are in the air. And we are used to thinking about sustainability as, oh, let's use less energy, right? And so we are focusing on that 72% most of the time. Currently, and you might have heard in the news, oh, Google is now carbon neutral, Amazon is now carbon neutral. Most of those folks are focusing on that 72%. In fact, when most people say that they are net zero or carbon neutral, they're only talking about neutrality on that 72% for the most part. There's this other 28%, which is the energy that has already been used, the carbon that's already been put in the air before anybody ever sets foot in a building, right? And that is all the carbon that's put in the air when the concrete is made, the glass is made, the bricks are made, the cement is made, the chairs are made, the lights are made, the textiles are made, all of that stuff, right? So that's about 28%. The problem is, as energy sources get better, that 72% piece is going to shrink. But because we're not doing anything about that 28% yet, projections are that 28% will become 49%. Okay, so most of our problem with climate crisis is not going to come from, oh, did you leave your light on for too long? Or is your light shining through the night? It's going to come from what type of lamp did you buy? Okay, and that's the big problem. Half of the responsibility is going to be in those interior design choices. So the second thing is life cycles. Look, architects build a building. Unless somebody comes and tears down that building is pretty much, nothing much is happening to it over its life, okay? So over a lifetime of a building, once the concrete and the steel and all of that has been put in place, it's not changing much. Interiors are different, right? Lamps wear out. You throw it out, you buy a new one. Offices, on average, are renovated every 5 years. In the tech sector, so the Googles, Amazons of the world, offices are being renovated every 3 years, okay? Hospitals do a full change of all their finishes at a minimum every 10 years. Hotels change out their entire furnishings every 5 to 7 years. And this is around the world, right? So while the building is not going anywhere, all the stuff that came into the building when it opened, 5 years from then, it's going to get thrown out. New stuff is going to come in. That's going to get thrown out. New stuff is going to come in, and that adds up over time. So there was a firm, an architecture firm in the US, in Seattle, in the city of Seattle, that did a study of their own office, right? How does that stack up? It turns out all those little brown bars are the carbon emissions of interiors, right? Interior renovations, every time the interiors have been changed. It adds up to more than the carbon emissions of actually building the office in the first place. Okay, so unless we do something about all the stuff that we do in the industry today, all that, all the decorative arts and the furniture and the lighting and the textiles and the carpets and the rugs and the wallpapers and all the things that we fill our homes and offices and hotels and hospitals and all of that with, unless we do something about all of that, we're never going to be able to address that part of the climate crisis. So this is where Metropolis has taken on its first project, which is, how do we start to work to educate interior designers on what they can do to reduce the carbon footprint of their work? So August 31st, in just a few days, we're launching a climate toolkit for interior design. And where the democracy part of it comes in now is, I want to talk to you about the process that we went through in putting together a toolkit, right? So we were very clear about certain things. So one is that you remember that graph about Republicans and Democrats, right? So obviously, we have a task to do in providing resources for folks who already are convinced, who already know that something needs to be done, but we can't only talk to them. We also have to talk to the folks who are just starting out, who barely maybe have an intention that they want to do the right thing, but they don't know what that right thing might be, right? Part of Metropolis's mission, at least the current editorial team and certainly my philosophy, is to meet people where they are, right? We need to move people forward at wherever they might be in their journey. If somebody is still at the stage of like, is climate crisis real? At least we want to bring them to the stage of like, yeah, it is real and I need to do something about it. If somebody is at the stage of, well, I'm already looking at the carbon footprint of everything that I'm working on, then we need to take them to the stage of, well, how do we now make it fully carbon neutral, right? So we have to carry different groups of people along in different ways. And that is primarily the crisis, the challenge that we face at Metropolis. The second thing I want to say, if it's not obvious already, is that creating things like this or putting together sort of processes like this is not a traditional editorial process, right? So usually, media publications tend to stay away from action in the real world because what they believe their ambit is, their sort of scope of work is to report on what's happening in the world, right? And through their reporting to influence the world. So it's also been a journey for Metropolis to understand, well, if we do have some influence in this sphere, is it right of us to not dive into action, right? What is the role that we play as a media organization? And part one of what we did, of course, was publish the article that we published about the carbon footprint of interior design, right? So yes, we did what traditional media outlets do. Normally, the next stage would have been, okay, what's our next article? And how do we follow that up with a set of 20 articles on the topic, right? But we also have a unique position as a trade publication that is very entrenched with a very, very niche audience, which is that we have influence, right? And we are also sort of a neutral party, right? We don't have all of the, we have some of the economic sort of motivations and incentives that others might have, but for the most part, we are not in the process of selling products to interior designers or selling interior designers data to product manufacturers. That's not what we're doing. So we can maintain a sort of neutral stance here. We can be a facilitator. And this speaks to some of my background in particular, because before I joined, well, as I was starting my career at Metropolis, actually, I was also involved with a volunteer nonprofit organization in New York City, which represents LGBTQIA individuals who come from South Asia, so from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. And as an organization, we were very focused on consensus building and on responsible facilitation of processes. So we used to hold a support group. I was trained to be a facilitator for those support groups. So there is some training in political tools and in tools, in democratic tools, in tools of how to bring together groups of people that had to come to play in this initiative around creating a toolkit for interior design. We held 12 workshops, 60 participants over 6 months. And there was so much preparation that had to go in at every stage before every workshop. There was and at Metropolis, our process was we would ask questions, get knowledge from whoever's participating in the workshop, go back, digest it, take it back to the people in the workshop and say, hey, does this represent what we talked about? Do you agree that this is a good representation of what we talked about, right? Then they would provide inputs. Sometimes they would say, yes, it is, but actually, I think I didn't say enough last time, right? sometimes they would say, yes, it is, but actually I think I was wrong because I thought about it after I went home and I realized that I said this, but actually I should have said that, right? So then we change it again, and then we bring it back to them again, right? And so all of that process had to go on in the background. And the number of organizations we were dealing with, we were absolutely clear that every one of those 12 workshops, which was 6 groups doing those 12 workshops, each of them needed to have representatives from all parts of the interior design industry, so to speak. So all kinds of folks who would have an impact on how interior designers work. And so that no one interest, so to speak, would outweigh the other. It's classic representative democracy. And so every group had practitioners, so interior designers themselves, industry associations, we had an academic think tank participate, we had product manufacturers participate, and then we had clients participate. We had contractors, so the folks who actually build interiors participate. We had real estate professionals participate. So we tried to bring together all the groups of people who work with interior designers and say, okay, we're discussing how to lower the carbon footprint of interior design, but unless Facebook as a client, as they're designing their offices, is willing to work with their interior designers to lower carbon footprint, the interior designers themselves are not going to get anywhere, right? So we need to have all the stakeholders involved in the process. And of course, we, even within the clients, that is the corporations part, we had Facebook and LinkedIn who represent, of course, the tech world, but we also had Ford who represents, more traditional manufacturing in the United States. And so it was a really interesting process. One of the interesting parts of it was how concerned folks were, and this is a very American thing. I don't know if it's true in Europe or not. Maybe you guys can tell me, and those of you who are on YouTube who are listening in, you can tell me as well. There was something that I like to, that I heard somebody say this, and I've just used the word, it's called green stealth. It's like, I believe in sustainability. You're my client. I know you don't believe in sustainability, so I'm not going to use the word, but I'm going to try to find ways to do what I need to do the right thing, right? Anyway, so it's kind of like subverting, if you want to be extreme, the aims of the client. So there was a huge discussion around how do we align the values of carbon footprint with the clients and stakeholders who interior designers have to deal with, basically the people who are going to pay them the money, right? How do you convince those people? How do you work with those people, right? And so there was all this discussion about just building a case for even saying, this is important, we need to act on this, whether you believe in climate change or not. And it's incredible that we're building a toolkit around the carbon footprint of interior design, and we have to still address people who might not even fully believe in climate change, right? Or the climate crisis. So, that sort of negotiation becomes really important, right? In terms of how we present information. And then the other thing was, and of course, not to assume that those people have bad intent, right? I think this is something that is necessary for my sanity personally and for the sanity of the Metropolis team. Those of you listening might disagree, but I, for one, don't believe that somebody doesn't believe in climate change out of malintent, right? Out of malice. They might, but I can't assume that, because once I assume that, then we don't have a conversation anymore. So I have to assume good intent, right? From anybody who reads this. But what I can't assume is knowledge. So, in the toolkit, we have to follow this policy of something for everyone. So, this is a good example that you're seeing here. It's like, okay, you're just starting out. Okay, here's a place you can go to educate yourself. If you need to convince clients, here's some tools that are resources that are out there. Okay, now you've started, and now you're ready to start to implement this in your work. Here are some tools that you can use. So in terms of, how do you select products, or how do you select the lighting and furniture and wall coverings and so on, here are some things that will help you make those selections. And then if you want to start to calculate the carbon footprint of your projects, here are some things that you can use. If you want to talk to other people who are doing the same kind of work you're doing and build community with them, here's a place you can go. And then here's what's coming in the future, so that if you've already done all of this, there's still something for you, because we're telling you this is the thing to look out for in the future, right? So it's an attempt, an imperfect attempt, obviously, to try and address different people at different stages of their journey. The second thing I want to talk to you about, and so that toolkit is launching August 31st, as I said. Part of our, sorry, I'd like to just go back for a second. Part of our intent there is also that once the toolkit is out in the world, we don't consider it a final resource, right? So this is another different way of thinking about storytelling and media publishing, right? Because Wikipedia exists. Right? So we know that it's possible to do collective information gathering and collective storytelling. The problem is, how do you set the structures for it and how do you put the boundaries around it? So currently what we're proposing is this toolkit is going to go out in the world on August 31st. And it's going to sit on our website, and on every page of the toolkit, it will say, if you have comments or if you have suggestions on how to improve this part of the toolkit, send us an email here. If you have questions about this toolkit, send us an email here. Right? So we as an organization become a kind of almost a node to gather people's sort of inputs, insights, anxieties. And the intention is, we'll convene the group of 60 people together again at some point next year and say, here are all the changes that folks on the internet have asked that we make to the toolkit. Are we ready to make these changes? And then we change it. And then we change it again a year from then, and a year from then, and a year from then. So hopefully we're able to create a resource that stays alive over time, right? That a story that kind of never stops being relevant, hopefully. So that brings us to our second part today, which is sustainability and interior design writ large. So remember, I told you we published an article about the carbon footprint of interiors. This is the cover of that issue. It says, "Interior Designers Save Us." I also want to point out to you that our 2003 cover said "Architects Pollute," and our 2020 cover says "Interior Designers Save Us." We've learned some things from the Trump era, and I think we've modulated our tone. And if you have any questions about that, I'd love to take them. We've certainly modulated our tone in terms of how we speak to our audience. How do we bring up difficult issues with our audience, right? In that issue, the story about the carbon footprint of interior design that I showed you, interior designers, your time is now, was certainly one of the pieces, but we had a whole bunch of other stories that interior designers are implicated in, all of them, right? So we had a story about how we can build affordable housing in the US. By the way, right now, I think about 20% of the US citizens can't afford a one-bedroom apartment, okay? Like, we have a housing crisis in the United States. There's a lot of people who can't afford decent living, okay, decent accommodation. So we had a story in there about how can we help people take over, abandoned buildings or rundown buildings and build the skill sets to refurbish them themselves. There's an amazing organization called Black Women Build in Baltimore in the US. So it's training Black women to, kind of build their own housing, so to speak. And interior design is implicated in that, right? Because people have to have a basic understanding of how to furnish a home, how to furnish spaces, and to make the right choices in those furnishings, to create that, to do that calculus between cost and climate of that. We had a story about the reuse of furniture, very squarely in the field of interior designers. And how do we stop furniture from landing in landfills? How do we stop carpet from landing in landfills? We had a story about indoor air quality. In the age of COVID-19, what do we do about clean air, right? Incidentally, we have a podcast called Deep Green. If you're interested, if you're a podcast person, we have a podcast called Metropolis Deep Green, and that's our latest episode on there as well. But so clearly we want to rally interior designers, not just around climate change, because that is taking a big problem, a large societal problem, and looking at it through one angle. But we know that the people who are most affected by climate change are also the people who have the least resources. We know that 75% of African Americans in the United States are more likely to live next to a factory that produces toxic waste. So there's climate, equity, justice, health, public health, all of these things are so intertwined. So we can pull out climate and create this climate toolkit for sure, but we have to acknowledge that you can't just pick the lowest carbon everything, because that might not be affordable in some cases. In some cases, that might not be healthy. So, we have to figure out how do we look at climate in the context of everything else that we care about in building a more just and sustainable society. And so obviously at Metropolis, we're like, we've done this story. We're going to start this process around climate, but we want to also start a process around sustainability as a whole. Again, this is particular to the US, architects in the United States, the American Institute of Architects, which is the professional organization of architects, has very clear commitments around sustainability. So even if there's not much action happening on the ground, at a policy level, at an industry level, there's an aspiration that's been set for architects. The same is not true for interior designers in the United States. And there's a few reasons for that. One of them is that there's a lot of different organizations for interior design. So we don't have just one party that makes the rules for what are the ethics for this profession. We have multiple organizations in North America. So we have the American Society of Interior Designers and the International Interior Designers Association, both of whom represent interior designers. And we also have the Interior Designers of Canada, which represents, of course, Canadian interior designers, who, by the way, might also be members of ASID and IIDA. So if we want to find out, whose neck do we catch, right, on this problem, we have a lot of necks, right? There's a lot of folks who are involved. But the good thing is each of these organizations has made progress in different areas. IIDA, for instance, this year is completely committed to start to build better equity in the interior design profession. ASID has been running an amazing series called Impact of Design, which is about looking at the impact of interior design on human health and human well-being. So there is momentum. It's just never coalesced and come together. So here's the problem. As Metropolis, we want to see the interior design profession in the US adopt some standards for what is considered responsible interior design practice. And those standards should include not just climate, but climate justice, should include social justice, should include public health and human health. There's a lot of things, right? How do we do that? So we started behind everybody's backs on this one a little bit. So we put together a committee of leaders in the interior design profession. So very senior interior designers, folks who sometimes are also the heads of sustainability at their firms, and some of those folks as well. And we just had a conversation. Okay, we want to create a pledge or a commitment for interior designers in the United States. How would we do that? And these were some of the questions that came back. Where does it live? Unfortunately, we have two organizations, which complicates things. So how can we all come together on this topic? And then, of course, the same question as with the climate crisis, how do we lower the threshold for people to become believers, right? How does this thing sound so obvious that people will say yes, and then be pulled into action around climate or equity or other things, right? So, and then the other thing the group acknowledged is that it's overwhelming. Like, we're telling interior designers, oh, you have influence on these really huge, big societal problems, things that, interior design school doesn't equip you for, that you may not have the tools or the wherewithal or the knowledge to even deal with. And, they said there's a kind of mourning happening among professionals when they see these big societal problems, but they don't know if they as professionals can help solve those problems. So how do we address both of those things? In our first round, we got too fixated on, how to hold people accountable. So we created this giant framework where we said, commit to doing these things, and here's how you check that you've actually achieved what you're doing. It was a very rigorous framework. We took it to the committee and they said, nobody's going to sign this, right? Because it's just too tough. And there's too many barriers. It's not going to do what you want to do. And then so the advice we got was focus on what motivates people. So we started out with a very simple statement that says that interior designers can actually make a difference. And I know you all can read, but I would like to read this out in full because it is important. Interior designers create the spaces that people live, work, heal, learn, relax, socialize, and play in. Designers' decisions also impact the interior design industry, comprised of designers, manufacturers, dealers, contractors, consultants, tradespeople, artisans, and other workers all around the world. So through this wide reach, interior designers have an influence to reduce global carbon emissions. The decisions interior designers make can also improve people's lives, support wellness and prosperity in communities, regenerate ecosystems, and help avert the climate crisis. We have a professional obligation to our peers, the public, and future generations to strive for a just, healthy, and sustainable society. So this was language that Metropolis helped frame, as an editorial entity, and and then we defined 4 commitments that people can make: design for climate, design for circularity, design for wellness, and design for equity. And each of those consist of smaller things that people might take on, and to acknowledge right from the start that you're never going to get to perfection on any of these. But the point is to at least have an understanding of the parameters and the factors that could influence your work, right? So currently we're in the process of talking to all of these organizations that I mentioned. And we're making great progress in aligning them around some language. I just this morning received feedback from ASID on some of that language that's in the pledge. And our intention is that we announced this Interiors Pledge for Sustainability at October 4th, which is when a major trade fair opens here in the United States. But that we announce it as a pledge that's not owned by any single organization, but that is owned collectively, amongst all the different organizations that have any kind of influence here in the interior design industry. So we start with the associations. We've brought on some competitor publications on board. We're hoping that they will sign on. So, reaching out to our peers in the media industry and asking them to join us as well. We're probably going to start speaking to manufacturers associations and so on and so forth as a stage 2. So there's huge work to be done still in terms of, creating a framework, for interior designers to act in. And so our dream is that interior designers that an interior designer, an individual professional in the United States can make a commitment through the pledge that commits them to doing the right thing in all of their projects. And they start the process of questioning what they do day in and day out through that. And then on the first one, which is around design for climate, they have the climate toolkit to help them take those first steps. And hopefully others in the landscape or in the ecosystem will create some resources for the other 3 commitments as well, or create better resources for design for climate. So, that's part of a democratic way of thinking about social change, is to understand that ownership and leadership sometimes are not good things. Sometimes you have to seed ownership, and sometimes you have to bring in co-owners before you even start something. Sometimes you have to, make sure you're not just leaving space, but that there is space for everyone, that you're not taking up too much space, that you're not taking all the air out of the room, right? Because that is a sure way to not making change happen, at least as far as the media is concerned. So, we're in this process of partnering, building connections, and building conversations with people, trying to make change in the world as an editorial organization. I have just a few minutes left here. Before I close out, I want to talk to you just a little bit about a third initiative, which is around what the Metropolis team is starting to call embodied justice. So if those of you who've been paying attention, if you remember, there was this term called embodied carbon. So just a reminder, embodied carbon is all the emissions that are put in the air through the processes that happen before a building is even built, right? To make the furniture, to make the lighting, to make the whatever, to ship it, to bring it to the site, to put it all together, all those emissions. What if we thought about justice in the same way? So right now, for the most part, when I come across at Metropolis editorial pitches for projects that we should be covering, where it speaks to social equity or justice, the focus is usually on, well, have people been part of a participatory process in how the building is designed, which is great, we should do that. Or it's about, what is the building going to do? Oh, it's a school for kids who don't have money. Oh, it's an apartment building that's affordable housing, so it's an equitable project. Oh, it's a park that serves a community that doesn't have a park, right? All of that is great. But are you thinking about the labor, the processes, the money that go into actually creating that stuff in the first place? I'll give you a small example. This was published in the issue that you're seeing here, which is, by the way, our 40th anniversary issue, just came out in August. We did an article where a university in the United States built a memorial to all the labor that was used on their campus who were slaves, right? So it was a way of correcting that correcting that history of slavery that was in the university. And they put out a request for proposals, a request for qualifications. Several firms applied, a firm got selected. That firm held a huge participatory process, brought in like local schools and local folks and like leaders in the community and Black people and like people whose grandparents were enslaved, and did an amazing job in terms of bringing in all the inputs to create the memorial, and then built the memorial. And then we find out that of all the teams who worked on actually making the memorial, who made money off of the memorial, only one team was Black owned, right? So while we're thinking about what buildings do in the world, it's the same problem. We think about that operations bit, how buildings are used. We don't think enough about how buildings are made, right? What are the justice and equity issues in how buildings and interiors actually come together in the first place, right? And so that's something we want to start to explore at the end of this year and into next year. So that's our next battle that we're opening up, another front, is around this idea of embodied justice. So stop talking about buildings that are great because Black people can come and use the building. Start talking about why Black people haven't made money out of the process of making that building, and why the chairs that were in that building were made in a factory that polluted a community in the place where it is, right? And so we have to dig deeper. And those are the stories we're hoping we can start to uncover in Metropolis over the next couple of years and start to, address that part of the problem as well. So that's it from me. Thank you. And I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Avi. I want to start asking you a question. Knowing how media organizations work, they are big ships that take a long time to steer if they are to change course. And the pledge that you as a media organization, as a publication, and you as the editor-in-chief of this publication have made is a long-term one. It's a long-term one, it's a commitment, and it's a fundamental shift in priorities. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it takes to have a publication, to have a ship this big, an institution, make that sort of change without a definite endpoint in sight, without a 6-month timeline, a 1-year timeline, a sort of open-ended, no end in sight change to how things will run from now on?
That's a great question. Thanks, Vera. There's two parts to that. So I'd like to talk about, as an organization, so for Metropolis, what the implications are, and then how we're seeing that big ship of the interior design profession and those organizations, we're asking them to take this plunge, right, without an end in sight. So there's two parts to this. So on the first part, as it turns out, Metropolis is not as big as you think. So Metropolis is part of a larger group of publications. We're called Sandow Design Group. Within that group is Interior Design, which is really the largest interior design publication in the United States. Interior Design Magazine. It's it's over 120 years old. It's a great publication. There's also Lux Interiors, which deals primarily with luxury homes, but is probably the largest residential design magazine in the US at this point. So, so we have fellow magazines or publications within our company that are way, way, way bigger than us. And just to give you a sense, the Metropolis's editorial team consists of 5 people and 2 designers, right? We are overall, if we count just Metropolis stuff, we're under 30. Right? So we're a small organization, but I think some things have worked in our favor on this. So first is that the larger organizations, the Sandow Design Group, has no doubt that carbon neutrality and addressing climate change is the point that we need to get to. And they don't have a doubt, just like a lot of large corporations in the US actually don't have a doubt on this. So many, many, many large corporations. So name them all, like the biggest corporations in the US, Amazon, Google, Apple, Ford, like GM, like name it. Like, I don't know, if you like Tesla, like all of these companies have made pledges to be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2040 or 2050. Some of them are already claiming carbon neutrality in their operations now. So in a way, it's also a thing of the cultural moment was there. So I think if it was 10 years ago, we couldn't have launched this. If it was 5 years ago, we probably couldn't have launched this, right? But we're at that cultural moment. And part of the advantage of being a media brand is that you're attuned to those sort of shifts in society. And that's what helps, right? So we're like, hey, we're hearing this, time to get our act together. And we can say that to people, and then people believe us because they're like, oh, yeah, they must be hearing it because they're Metropolis. And so we can get that ball rolling. Some things are tough to change. For instance, we are in the process of talking about the carbon footprint of Metropolis itself. About 60% of our carbon footprint comes from our paper. And we sourced our paper for the last 2 years from one of the most sustainable paper mills in the world. And they gave us Forestry Stewardship Council certified paper. And then, there's a paper crisis. None of you you're not in the media industry, you don't know this. If you're in the media industry, paper is tough to find. Like if you want a particular paper, if you're okay with any paper, there's lots of paper. But if you want a particular paper, like supply chains are disrupted and so on, there's a lot going on with all the other stuff that's happening in the world. And in the middle of that, we're talking about how do we make Metropolis carbon neutral. And we know even that is going to be a 3, 4, 5-year journey. I mean, honestly, we're going to start, we're going to report every step we take. And I really take to heart 2 things. Bill McDonough, who started the Cradle to Cradle Products Innovation Institute and started this whole he was one of the pioneering thinkers around the circular economy. He said it's always too late and it's always time to start. Right? So that's just the reality on most of these things. It's always too late, but it's always a good time to start. The second thing is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So this is a major thing I've learned is if we can only do a story about this tiny corner right now, but I know that what we're really interested in is that bigger story, we'll do that tiny story now, and then see how it goes, right? And honestly, that is also how democratic processes work. And a lot of people don't understand that now. Everybody wants change instantly, but you have to build. You have to build change. It happens over time, right? And it happens, the best kind of change happens with consensus from large groups of people who all act through different incentives and motivations. So you can't expect everyone to do the right thing, but do it believing the exact same thing that you do. If you want both of those things, it's a formula for failure, in my opinion. Let people do things for the reasons that motivate them, as long as they're doing the right thing. And then we build culture over time. Culture is us, right? And that's to do with the second piece as well. One of the big things that helps is because all these large corporations have made these carbon neutrality pledges, and those corporations are the clients for interior designers, the large interior design firms are predisposed to agree with the aims of the pledge. The problem is when we start saying equity and so on and so forth, it's going to get into sticky territory for somebody or the other. So for now, we're doing a workaround, and we're saying that the pledge is not for organizations to take, but for individuals to take. So we start taking individual responsibility within organizations. So if I'm an interior designer working at XYZ firm, I take the pledge and I start to see how I can change my work. And if enough of my colleagues take the pledge, then we formed a little team within our company who's trying to make change. And then if enough people across firms are starting to take the pledge, then if one team is doing really well, then maybe other teams will see that and start to build change. So, it's, I don't know, economists would call it social choice theory or something. Like, it's basically, get the input from organizations, but motivate individuals to take action. That's a formula, again, we're hoping will work. And this is not something none of this is something we came up with. Obviously, that's why we brought together these committees and these groups of people, because they advise us on like what works and what doesn't work. And so hopefully the collective wisdom will pan out. And we'll see. I mean, maybe this will be a dud. Maybe we'll put it out there, nobody will sign it, nobody will want to do anything with it, and that'll be the end of it, right? So we'll see, but that's part of it. Like you have to start, because it's too late, but it's also time to start,
That's a beautiful quote. I will remember that. Avi, you offered that we could ask questions about the language that you're using, and I would like to accept that offer. But I would like to specify, because I think there are really two challenges in this. One is, how do you convince those who don't believe? Because usually, at least to my experience, and also what we can see, unfortunately, is that facts don't matter, right? People believe what they want to believe, no matter what the factual framework is. That's one thing. The other thing is, how do you speak to the audience? What I found really interesting is that all of the issues that you're addressing, climate, circularity, wellness, equity, embodied justice, they're all highly, highly political topics, but you never even use the word politics once in your presentation, which is really interesting. So in my personal opinion, I think that design is a highly political profession, but most designers don't take that responsibility, and they aren't even aware of the fact how political the profession is. So how do you speak to those who do believe in those causes, but don't think, politics is their business?
Yeah.
So two answers.
Absolutely. So on the people who don't believe, I don't have a great answer for you. And I will admit that. I think what we're hoping is, if enough of the organizations that have leadership in the field, so if we're talking about US interior design, there's a few big magazines, there's a few industry associations, there's a council that regulates interior design education in the United States. It's called IDCC, or IDEC, and then IDCC is their continuing education. And then, of course, the schools who's teaching interior design. So there's a few stakeholders who basically influence interior design profession. And the idea is that if we get enough of the stakeholders to start to say this is the right thing to do, then the people who don't believe will change their minds or align their professional practices, at least if they've not changed their minds. So, to some extent, if you are working on a 200,000 square foot, we're in the US, we still use this old system, I'm sorry about the feet, but this 200,000 square foot space for Google, and Google says it has to be carbon neutral. I mean, you don't believe in climate change, but like you're still going to crunch numbers and make sure your client gets what they want. You know what I'm saying? So so we're banking on hopefully that kind of momentum a little bit. And we'll see. And honestly, that momentum was building even during the Trump administration. So that's good news for us. It seems that even despite the political dispensation, we have some good news on that. The second thing about not using politics, I think, comes from a belief on my end that everything human beings do is political, right? Calling something political it's like we all breathe air. Do we need to know that air is all around us in order to survive? You know what I'm saying? Every single thing we do is political. Like I have an argument with my partner, that's political. I go out and buy this loaf of bread instead of that loaf of bread. Ultimately, that's a political choice because I'm sure those companies have some background and something, and there's a consequence to my decisions. Somebody made money, somebody didn't make money. My choice, whether I made it consciously or not, has affected other people's lives. What is that if it's not politics, right? So, everything is political. So in a way, it's almost pointless to call it out. What we mean is that these are deeply politically controversial issues in that there is a wide range of opinion around them. That's what the point of a pledge is that it posits an opinion as or a framework as the current preferred framework for the profession, right? So what we're trying to say is like, this is the preferred way of thinking about interior design right now. That's what we're trying to do. Like you may have many ways of thinking about it. This is what, this is the preferred way currently, and a lot of people are agreeing on that. Or rather, by signing the pledge, you say that you agree that this is your preferred way of working as an interior designer, right? So it just gives you a way to articulate a choice that you may not have had a chance to articulate before, hopefully, right? And we've seen this. I mean, we're not the ones to invent this, by the way. Like none of this is new. I mean, the architecture profession in the US did this. Like Ed Masria created the 2030 challenge. AIA adopted it. The association, the American Institute of Architects, adopted it. And a lot of people signed it, and a lot of people still work according to its principles. And so it creates change. It does. Like it took many years to do it, but it does create change. You saw that graph, our carbon emissions are coming down, right? So it does make a difference. 27 firms this year met their commitments towards carbon neutrality. I'm just going to make it simple. They did it through a certain process that the American Institute of Architects has set up and so on. This report came out this year. Seems like a small number of firms, but between them, they control a huge footprint of real estate, right? But it's not just those 27 firms who met the milestone that are important. Thousands of firms signed the commitment and are reporting their progress. They may not have made the progress, but they're working on it. That's really important. It's not just important to, meet the goal. Yes, it's important to meet the goal, I know, but like it's also important to work towards it. So we know that giving people the chance to articulate a choice makes a difference. We've seen some examples of that in our industry. So we're safe to assume, hopefully, this will follow the same path and we will be successful. So yeah, even though we're not overtly saying, hey, people, make a political choice by doing this. It's implicit. You're making a choice and you're articulating position by signing the pledge, just as it's implicit in the millions of things we do every day as human beings.
Thank you, Avi. We're going to have to close and wrap up because our time has come to an end, and we are going to go into a more informal mode with our participants here in Pillnitz. This has been the last of our digital talk series. Thank you so much, Avinash, for your time, for your insights, and for being with us. I'm going to say goodbye here from Pillnitz with Amelie, to sending a big hug to Avinash in New York City, and a big thank you to everybody